Alison Loat is here. She's the executive director of Samara, and that's a research company. They recently put out a report entitled The Real Outsiders, Politically Disengaged Views on Politics and Democracy. Good morning.
Good morning.
Essentially, people aren't showing up to vote. They are not. This is why I take my kid, plural, when I go to vote. Why are people so disengaged? It seems like one of the reasons people always say is they just feel like their one vote doesn't count. Is that it?
Yeah, it's probably a bit more than that. I mean, one of the things that was interesting in hearing from people who don't participate, who opted not to participate in politics, is you realize we spend a ton of time in politics land focusing on the 40 days around an election and very little time talking about the 1,200 days in between. Mm-hmm. And when you talk to people who have chosen not to participate in politics, it's what they say anyway, is the way that they experience government or their interaction with politicians in those 1,200 days are a lot more important than what happens in the 40 days. So by the time you get to bring someone to the polls, at least for these folks, they'd long ago decided that this just wasn't worth their time.
This is one of my pet peeves, the low voter turnout. I think the last federal election, it was historically the lowest voter turnout. But I've had debates with people who say that it says nothing about engagement. Because, people do engage outside of the voting process. So is that an accurate...
There's no more powerful way to engage than by voting.
Oh, whether they're volunteering or they're part of groups that work on civic issues or other issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, a couple of things. First, people who do more statistical research on this, it shows there's actually a really high correlation between people who volunteer or protest, like we saw in Occupy, and people who vote. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of overlap in those groups. The people we spoke to who are disengaged, what they said is that often it was their direct experience in trying to participate in the past, and that had been so frustrating that it turned them away. So it's kind of like you're not born disengaged, you're made disengaged by your experience.
What's frustrating about the process, though? What do they mean?
Everyone has their own story. So we talked to 7 different groups of disengaged people across the country. And so, I mean, just to give a couple of examples, sometimes it's trying to get services from government or trying to get an issue resolved. So there's actually a very moving and sad story of a woman who is unemployed in Montreal who registered for a government-sponsored retraining program to be a chef, which had always been her dream. Midway through, the bureaucrat who she'd never really talked to switched her into another program. She hated it. She dropped out and went on social assistance. So it's actually not always the election and the politicians that's driving them people away, but their experience in just trying to get help or heard from government more generally. So people don't always distinguish between the two. It's something that we don't usually talk about in all this stuff.
But it is, with the boomer bubble going through, which seems to affect all the demographics everywhere, isn't there just a certain amount of cynicism and fatigue with the process? These are people that lived through Nixon and everything else and may have had their fondest political hopes
behind
dashed.
them. Yeah, well, I think there is a lot. I mean, there's a lot of negative stereotypes of politicians are alive and well. The very first thing we did in these conversations is ask people just to use words to describe politics, and they're not pretty, right? Yeah. So, confusing, very negative words. Corrupt was another one. Lies. But then we asked them to talk about democracy, and there's sort of like a pause of, oh yeah, right, and then you hear better words like freedom and equality and hope and all kinds of positive words. So it's this sort of disconnect between people's ideals of democracy and the way they experience it every day through politics. So it's kind of, democracy is great, but it's the politics I hate.
Here in Canada, do you think it would help if we switched over to a proportional representation kind of system? Because some people feel that their vote won't even matter if you've got in your riding someone who is, a sure win, like a liberal, let's say a candidate who's a sure win. What's the point of voting another party? Right.
Whenever people say that, I always remind them decisions are made by people who show up. So if you don't show up, it won't change. But in the people we talked to, this never came up once. Okay. So it wasn't a matter of wanting system change at all. It was much more basic. We want to be heard. We want our concerns to matter. We want there to be some sense of responsiveness when we need help or when we try to participate, or when I phone my elected official, it would be great if the call were returned. I mean, it was actually much more basic service comments that we heard much more than things like, let's change the voting system. So I think it's a lot more back to basics than a lot of the current discussion around this usually.
Did you notice any patterns in terms of who you spoke with? Did this cut across all socioeconomic backgrounds, age? In terms of the level of disengagement?
Yeah, we did. We did focus groups with people who all identified as not being interested in politics. It's always funny. Or come and talk about something you hate, But their stories were really similar across the board. So there wasn't a lot of difference from, the group of new Canadians, for example, from that who were, of a lower socioeconomic status to young people. Across the board, a lot more consistency than at least I think we were expecting.
And you said, I was told that this report is one of a beginning of a series that you'll do yearly, looking at the state of democracy in Canada. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think most Canadians, as we know, take great pride in being a democratic country, and we promote this abroad, and we encourage other countries to be the same, but we do very little sort of analysis of how well we're doing at home. And we know, as you guys have said, election after election, fewer people are showing up. So there's something to be said for looking critically at home as well. So we'll be doing a bunch of reports over the next couple of years that will culminate in an annual democracy index, which will be a little bit of a report card on how we're doing. Look at political parties, parliament, citizens' participation and perceptions, and also how media covers and frames different policy issues.
How do we differ from the States as far as voter turnout? I mean, the politics there is so polarized. You know what I'm saying? And here, we kind of have this soft, mushy middle that everybody ends up in. And do you think that's a factor at all?
Yeah, I mean, our voter turnout's a bit higher than the U.S., depending on the province that you look at, of course. But a lot of people have asked this. And this is part of the tricky thing, is that sometimes the incentive for a political party is not to actually reach out to somebody who is not engaged. I mean, for example, the new Canadians we spoke to, people have said, well, politicians are desperately going after this group. Well, the people we spoke to didn't even mention interaction with a politician at all. So I think there's a lot to be said about the role of a political party in the 21st century. It's their role to engage Canadians. These are tax-supported organizations, and at least if the people we spoke to are any indication, they're not going beyond who they've already identified as their existing voters. So that probably exacerbates it.
We do tend to vote against as much as vote for, don't we, if not more so?
Yeah, a lot of people say that now.
Yeah.
You tend to vote against something. And so, again, this goes back to, is there a way that political parties, at minimum, can start to engage people and give people a reason to vote for something. So that's a good place to start anyway.
Who funded the study, just out of curiosity?
So Samara is a charitable organization, charitable research organization, and I co-founded it with a retired media CEO. So he provides most of the initial funding, but as we expand the research, as you were talking about, we'll hope others will believe this is also important and help support us.
Well, thank you so much. Alison Loat, the executive director of Samara.
Which means?
Samara is the helicopter seed that comes from the maple tree, so it's the seed of Canada.
It has a name. The seed of Canada,
There we go.
728. Thanks, Alison.
Thank
We'll be back
you.